Syria is ruled by a dictatorship, so we don't need to kind of disagree. I'm sure this audience here would also agree with me that Syria is ruled by a dictatorship, and this dictatorship has been going on for decades. And me, as somebody who also fought against Saddam's regime, involved in campaigns of human rights, I've always thought that the ideological umbrella of the Ba'ath Party and the way it organizes in Syria and Iraq and the Middle East has very authoritarian, dictatorial tendencies to it, and chauvinistic towards national minorities of the region and so on. So I've always been a critic of Baathism in general as well. So when the demonstrations started in Syria, I was one of the people who welcomed them, supported them publicly and so on. But immediately you could see that the scenario of Libya was trying to be transposed and transported very quickly onto Syria. It is now well established that within days, literally days of the start of the uprising in Syria, there were snipers appearing amongst or near the demonstrators. One of the leaders of these demonstrations, uprisings, somebody who's very prominent in the democratic opposition in Syria, Haytham al-Manna, his name is. You can listen to some of his speeches in English on the internet. He's quite a prominent leader. His own brother actually killed at the demonstrations by Bashar's forces. He's on the record as saying, and he said it here in London as well in a lecture at the London School of Economics a couple of months ago, that he was offered, he and all the other leaders of the Syrian uprisings who were released from prison, been visiting prisons for decades, they were offered arms within 5 days of the start of the demonstrations in Daraa in Syria along the Jordanian borders. There was an immediate attempt to intervene in Syria to transform the spontaneous people's movement into a militarized conflict. Militarization does not serve the democratic movements. Usually these revolutions, uprisings, only resort to self-defensive type violence. It's true that the Syrian regime started opening fire on demonstrators and so on, but the way the Syrian people, I think, would have reacted would have been like the Egyptian people, like the Tunisian people. There is an attempt to repulse repression, but not through a rapid process of militarization and clashing immediately with a very powerful state when you haven't brought millions onto the streets yet. They had few thousand, tens of thousands. The biggest demonstration was in Hama of about 250,000 people. But the main cities of Syria had not joined yet, and they would have joined had the conflict not been militarized so early. Damascus, significantly, the capital city. Aleppo, the most important city of Syria, is Aleppo rather than Damascus. It's the trading, industrial, in some ways historic city, even historically more important than Damascus. Aleppo did not have any significant demonstrations, and other major cities. And militarization was encouraged by Turkey. Immediately you had centers established in Turkey to supply arms, infiltrators into Syria. Some of these fighters, hundreds of them, came from Libya, through the Lebanese borders as well, Turkish borders, of course, some from Iraq, and from Afghanistan as well, some as far as Chechnya. Jihad was declared on the Syrian regime by all the prominent Salafi religious leaders, particularly Saudi, Qatari-based religious leaders. Significantly, somebody called Qaradawi. Qaradawi is probably one of the most prominent, historically moderate religious leader. But in the last few years, he transferred his headquarters from Egypt to Doha in Qatar, and he issued a famous fatwa calling for jihad in Syria. And nearly all the religious leaders in Saudi Gulf, obviously some within Syria itself, particularly somebody prominent called Sheikh Ar'ur, they all called for taking up arms and declaring jihad on the Syrian regime. Now, militarization ultimately weakened the people's movement, ultimately strengthened the regime, because the regime would rather send its army and troops against armed men rather than face millions of people on the streets. And the politics of that conflict degenerated such that the most prominent military forces on the opposition side, the armed opposition, I make a distinction. I call those forces which are happy with militarization, foreign intervention, and so on, as the military opposition or militarized opposition or armed opposition. And I call the rest of the opposition as the democratic opposition. And there are prominent organizations whose literature we can read broadly. Prominent amongst them is the الهيئة الوطنية للتغيير الديمقراطي في سوريا. The National هيئة التنسيق الوطنية, the National Coordinating Committee for Democratic Change in Syria. This is an umbrella grouping of some 17 democratic organizations representing also the Kurdish minority in Syria. Now, once these forces that were allied to Turkey, to Qatar, to Saudi Arabia, and calling for NATO intervention became so pronounced, backed by, very significantly by Al Jazeera television and Al Arabiya television. Al Arabiya TV is a Saudi finance station, and Al Jazeera television is owned by the Qatari royal family. And they played a major role in the militarization of conflict in Syria. And they gave prominence to all these organizations which had either a Muslim Brotherhood leaning or even worse, some of these terrorist organization leanings. Now, what did this also produce within Syria? It produced fear amongst women in Syria in general, because women in Syria, historically speaking, have had more rights, infinitely more rights than anything that might exist in Gulf states in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf. They have been more engaged in public life, all the professions in Syria and so on. So it produced fear, not out of love for the regime, but they were frightened of what might come next in terms of these organizations that are active within Syria. It produced fears amongst Christians because some of these organizations openly are anti-Christian, attacking religious centers, churches, and so on. Some 80,000 Christians fled the city of Homs. It's weird that we live in a predominantly Christian country, but the oppression that the Syrian Christians are receiving from these fundamentalist or terrorist type organization doesn't figure in the news because our political agenda is a bit different. Kurds, the Kurdish people in Syria, fear Turkey much more than they fear the Syrian regime, because Turkey has been engaged in an active war that has been going on for about 30 to 40 years. They have already killed about 20,000 Kurds in that military conflict within Turkey. But since Turkey is a member of NATO, close ally, its crimes against the Kurdish people go almost unreported, including the assassination about 10 days ago now, of the 3 women leaders of the Kurdish autonomy movement. They were assassinated in Paris. Under any other circumstances, such a horrible crime would have received much more prominence, and our media would have focused on it. But Turkey is an ally, so we don't talk much about that. In fact, we cast doubt on their crime and say maybe it's an internal conflict within the PKK, the main Kurdish organization in Turkey. So you have an amalgam of political forces, social movements within Syria, which are more terrified of the military opposition than of the Syrian regime. And hence, that's why we have the Syrian regime staying in power for so long. It's not a mystery. They've been predicting the fall of the Syrian regime for so long, and I don't think it will fall so easily, because most of the people are not so enthusiastic about the military opposition. They want democracy in Syria, and these forces will not bring democracy to Syria. Syria is crucial to the Middle East for many reasons, and this relates to Israel. The Lebanese armed resistance to Israeli occupation has been mainly armed by Syria. Even Iranian support had to be channeled through Syria. So Hezbollah in Lebanon and all the other political forces allied to Hezbollah who fought against Israeli incursions and the occupation of southern Lebanon by Israel were armed by Syria. Tens of thousands of their rockets and so on were Syrian supplied. So Syria posed a problem in that sense to US and Israeli policy in the region. Hamas in Gaza, Hamas headquarters was in Damascus, and most of Hamas's armaments also came from Syria. So Syria played an important role in terms of opposition to Israel and to U.S. policy. Syria stood against the occupation of Iraq, and it allowed some arms supplies into resistance against U.S. presence in Iraq as well. This enormously upset the United States against the Syrian regime. And attempts to topple the Syrian regime actually started from 2003 onwards with the occupation of Iraq. Syria became a close ally of Iran, and that also poses an enormous problem for U.S. policy in the region. Iran being the most important or the only practically strong state left, not only in the Middle East, but in the so-called Greater Middle East, up to Russia's and China's borders, that this is the one state which is strong, which is rich, which is not under U.S. domination. Iran poses a strategic problem for U.S. hegemony and control of the entire Middle East.